Boa tarde a todos. Essa é a nossa última mesa. Espero que todos tenham aproveitado bastante as palestras e a contribuição dos nossos convidados. E nós temos o prazer de receber agora a Julia Whitehead. E eu vou primeiro apresentá-la em português e depois vou apresentá-la em inglês. Então, Julia Whitehead é fundadora do Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library, é autora de Breaking Down Kurt Vonnegut, de 2022, o livro acabou de sair, é ex-oficial militar, professora de escola internacional, escritora e editora em uma companhia farmacêutica, em editoras, jornais e revistas. Julia Whitehead is a Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library founder. She is the author of Breaking Down Vonnegut, published in 2022, very recently. She's a former military officer, international school teacher, a writer and editor for a pharmaceutical company, publishing houses, newspapers, and magazines. It's a pleasure to have Julia with us this afternoon, and we would like to thank you warmly for accepting to share your thoughts and ideas with us. And we know that you are in the middle of the road, literally, right? So there you go. The floor is all yours now.
Thank you so much. And yes, I did share with you all that I am driving to Washington, D.C. tonight. So I have about another 8 hours ahead of me. But I pulled over to a McDonald's. So that's where I am. Hopefully today we will have lots of questions and knowledge sharing and laughs. We have to have laughs because, Vonnegut said, and I'll quote from my book, Vonnegut said, "Laughs are exactly as honorable as tears. Laughter and tears are both responses to frustration and exhaustion, to the futility of thinking and striving anymore. I myself prefer to laugh since there's less cleaning up to do afterward." So thank you so much for having me here today. I'll share a little bit about our museum and things that we do, a little bit about my book, and I'll share some of Vonnegut's thoughts on science fiction. The title of my presentation, Vonnegut had said that science fiction was treated like a urinal when it came to writers, all the different genres that science fiction writers were not high on the list of from the literary critics. So we want to change that thinking, but also I want to provide a few insights into Vonnegut, and hopefully we can understand him a little bit more. But I do look forward to your questions. But so Vonnegut, fascinating subject, right? In my book, I cover 3 chapters of biography of Vonnegut that, I've been learning over these almost 14 years since I had the idea for the Vonnegut Library. And, I was capturing those stories, putting them in a little box that someday I would do something with. And then about a year ago, it was May of last year, the publisher came to me and said, "We have to have a book about Vonnegut completed in 3 months. If you're going to sign this contract, please understand that you don't get even one more day to write that book." So I did it. I signed the contract. So if there's something you don't like about my book, please understand it was the best I could do in 3 months. But let's talk a little bit about Vonnegut. One thing that I thought was so fascinating about him is he liked, even with science fiction, he didn't like the fact that the literati categorized science fiction as, less of a skilled genre of writing than others. But I think Vonnegut liked that he was part of the group of science fiction writers. I think that he considered them to be interesting and focused on the things that he was also interested in, mainly the fact that technology and, machines were replacing human beings. And I believe you all heard about player piano earlier in this conference, but that is also one of the books that I covered in my book about Vonnegut. I also covered Slaughterhouse 5, and I did Harrison Bergeron, the short story Harrison Bergeron. I'm not sure if that was among the things you've read, but boy, that is a crowd pleaser, Harrison Bergeron. And I think there is a misunderstanding about that book. About that short story and what he was trying to say. And I try to set the record straight with my book, because I think some people misunderstand and think that Vonnegut was saying that these are the problems that will arise if we have equality. And really, it was the opposite. He was making fun of the people who had concerns about, at that time, about, civil rights and what would happen when civil rights was passed and all of that. So hopefully we can understand that Kurt Vonnegut was on the side of all of us being brothers and sisters all over the planet. He didn't always say the most politically correct things, but he did think that we were, that we were all brothers and sisters. And that, I think that's really important. I also admire the fact that he did write from completely different perspectives, whether he was writing from the perspective of an African American child or a female or a Jewish person, or, all of these different kinds of people. It's kind of risky, and at least I don't know what it's like in your country, but we've got a lot going on in the United States these days, and especially today. We just had some news come from the Supreme Court. It's a hard time to be in the United States, but it's also, always pretty good compared to lots of places. But I admire that he wrote from different perspectives and tried to show the value of human beings. There's when we think about player piano and some of the other things that he said in his science fiction writing, it wasn't just the fact that machines were doing all of this. It's what that meant to the working person, and how Vonnegut felt that jobs create dignity for people, no matter what kind of job you're doing. If you are doing an honest day's work, there's dignity in doing a job. And he thought that, he thought people should be respected. And we see that in player piano, all the different levels of engineers and other roles in that company he describes in the book Player Piano. I wish that I knew, if all of you in the audience, if you've read very much Vonnegut, which short stories you've read and all of those things. So I'd love to talk about that, what you like and that sort of thing. But maybe you've heard this quote, but I'm going to share it. So he said in an interview, he said, "In the beginning, I was writing about what concerned me, and what was all around me was machinery. I myself had some training in engineering and chemistry rather than in the arts, and I was working for General Electric in a big factory city, Schenectady. So the first book I wrote was about Schenectady, which is full of machinery and engineers, and I was classified as a science fiction writer. Well, in the past, science fiction writers have been beneath the attention of any serious critic. That is, far above you are the people dealing with the really important, beautiful issues and using great skills and so forth. It used to be that if you were a science fiction writer, you really didn't belong in the arts at all, and other artists wouldn't talk to you. You just had this scruffy little gang of your own." And so I submit to you that Vonnegut, while he didn't like being categorized as a science fiction writer, I think he also kind of did, because he liked being a bit subversive, and also the company that he kept with Ray Bradbury and some of the other great science fiction writers, you know, he had a good friendship with them, and you know, so there was some camaraderie there. I talk a little bit in my book about Vonnegut when he was in the war, and he could have gone in as a military officer. He certainly, you know, came from a wealthy family here in Indianapolis, and he had been educated, even though he didn't have that college degree. He still had, you know, a few years of college under his belt, and his family was very upset that he did not become an officer because they thought that he would be better protected if he had been an officer rather than an enlisted soldier. But that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to just, you know, be a regular soldier and not get any special treatment. I think that's such a fascinating fact about Vonnegut, because we see when we look at his experience in Slaughterhouse-5, which is, you know, partly science fiction, but then also partly based on his experience in World War II being captured by the Nazis. There is a sense of pride that he shares. Not only, he doesn't only mention it in that book, but he also mentions it in interviews he had given, you know, and other things where he says that he felt proud that he was with the foot soldiers, you know, and not in the officer corps. I was a military officer. Thank you for mentioning that. I was a Marine Corps officer, and it was during the period when Bill Clinton was president. And thankfully for me, I didn't have to deal with any very difficult situations. But Vonnegut certainly did, as we know from his description of events in Slaughterhouse-5. And here's a little secret: if you don't know, if you've read Slaughterhouse-5, the main character Billy Pilgrim, people think that character is Kurt Vonnegut, you know, writing about himself. And even though the details he provides about what it was like to be captured by the Nazis, to be put on this train that was taking people into Germany, to these, you know, prisoner of war camps. And while he was on the train was strafed by the Royal Air Force. And so what we see when we read Slaughterhouse-5 and that description of that boxcar being strafed, and, you know, these soldiers, prisoners, American and British prisoners being, you know, trapped together on this boxcar, and some of them are dying from the strafing, which was done because the Allies thought that the train was filled with either German soldiers or, you know, war material, or, you know, something that would be needed for the war effort. So they did not know they were American soldiers on that train, Americans and others. So, but anyway, I'm coming to a point here, and it's basically that wonderful dichotomy that is Kurt Vonnegut, that he loved being connected with, I'll just say, regular people, just the common person. But then he also loved he loved being a gentleman and having access to people who were very well known in their fields. When he grew up in Indianapolis, his parents were, you know, like I said, they're a very wealthy family. He knew all of the wonderful artists and sculptors and writers, and, you know, in his time, there were some who were on the national level. So he had that wonderful cultural capital growing up, even though the family was hit very hard by the economic issues caused by the Great Depression and, you know, all of that. But then that led him to go from a private school, you know, expensive school, to the public school environment where everybody was being educated. And we see this with Vonnegut writing about how important the Indianapolis public schools were to him, because at that time, the schools were very well funded. And his high school, Shortridge, they had lots of clubs. They had teachers who were, they were very well educated. They could be college professors. Some of them were, but that it was an extraordinary experience for him in the public schools of Indianapolis. And, he did talk about that and write about that. So that, that was wonderful for him. But let me get to some of his other quotes that relate to science fiction. So he said, there used to be a feeling amongst reviewers that anyone who knew how a refrigerator works can't be an artist too. Machinery is important. We must write about it, but I don't care if you don't. I'm not urging you, am I? To hell with machinery. So we know from his time at General Electric that he had access to all of these amazing technological developments that were happening at the time that the general public would not know about for years and years. And he could see those things as the public relations person for General Electric. Also, the fact that his brother was a scientist working for GE. And you may know that he was involved in cloud seeding. So basically pouring a chemical into clouds, and then that would produce rain. And so there's a whole area of study on what that was and what that could do, how that could damage the environment. And, so Vonnegut's watching all of this stuff happen. And, he wrote about Ice Nine in the book Cat's Cradle. That's a great one for science fiction, right along with regular, relationships. And there is religion in Cat's Cradle. He actually creates a religion in that book. And that was based on his study of anthropology at the University of Chicago when he came back from the war. Thankfully, when the Russians liberated Dresden, Germany, and he was able to make his way back to the United States. And then he married his longtime girlfriend, Jane, and then they went off to the University of Chicago together to study. And then Jane became pregnant with their son, Mark Vonnegut. Mark was named after the great Mark Twain. But Kurt had to quit school, again, did not finish a degree. He went to work for the Chicago News Bureau to raise money for his family. And it was while he was there that he was offered that job at General Electric. His brother was already out in Schenectady working for GE. But what that did for his readers, his time working for the Chicago News Bureau, he saw horrific things while he was in that position. He had to write about, all sorts of, deaths and other things. But also there was that, the writing style that he developed, his ability to write in short sentences that are very clear. I love that. One more thing about my book. It's so when the publisher approached me, they said, this will be for, high school students, this book. I was kind of relieved because I'm not an academic. I did all this stuff. I was a pharmaceutical writer, and I worked for Random House, and I taught English in Thailand, and I was in the military and all this stuff. So I was intellectually insecure about writing a book when there are all these great scholars like Robert Talley and all these other folks, Mark Leeds and others, Rodney Allen and Christina Jarvis. Anyway, so I just decided to write the book the way that I would want to read. I tried to take some of Vonnegut's lessons on, writing for a general audience and short, clear sentences. So hopefully you see that in my book. But let me go back to what I said about Vonnegut and machines and knowing how a refrigerator works, that was one really amazing thing about him, is all of that science background, but he had such a longing to write. And if you have not read the book of letters that was compiled by his daughter, Edith, it's so wonderful if you're a big Vonnegut fan, because it's letters that he wrote to his first wife, Jane, when they were dating. They were in college, and then later he was in the war, and he was, communicating with her, writing those letters. There is only one letter from Jane, but there were, dozens of letters from Kurt to Jane, and you see the evolution of a writer. And it is also very clear that Jane influenced him. She was not just a cheerleader for his writing, but then she really, after they got married, she went on to, to be that, like a publicist almost for him, or an agent in some ways, where she's writing letters to magazines, trying to get them to publish his short story, or to book publishers to try to get him to them to accept his book. And he knew he had, with Slaughterhouse-5, he knew he had such an important story there, that definitely needed to be told. But he introduces science fiction with the planet Tralfamadore, which everybody loves if they're into Vonnegut. But let me read this. This was an interview he did with Playboy magazine, and he said, well, the question posed to him was, what made you to decide to write it in a science fiction mode? And Vonnegut responded, this is just a portion of what he said, but he said, and the science fiction passages in Slaughterhouse-5 are just like the clowns in Shakespeare. When Shakespeare figured the audience had enough of the heavy stuff, he'd let up a little, bring on a clown or a foolish innkeeper or something like that before he'd become serious again. And trips to other planets, science fiction of an obviously kidding sort, is equivalent to bringing on the clowns ever so often to lighten things up. And, we see that with Player Piano, with the character, the Shaw of Broadpoor. And we just, we love that about Vonnegut, because those characters, sometimes they lighten things up. A lot of times they provide a piece of knowledge that is brilliant and important, and is something that is not necessarily being considered by the vast majority of people. So, he uses science fiction in such, beautiful, wonderful ways in his work. I think it's wonderful that following his death, we didn't know, would he be a famous writer who would continue to, be read, long after his death. And now, all these years later, after starting this museum, I feel so very comfortable that his work will endure for centuries, because it is about all the things that matter to people, no matter what happens to be going on with, with the technology. He was writing about a player piano and how that took a job away from someone who would sit and, beautifully play the piano. But we see all of these technological advances all the time, and know that there are people who are losing their jobs because of that. And, what does that mean? How do we then reintegrate those workers into the labor force so that they can feel like they have a job that is providing them with dignity and giving them that ability to do what everybody wants to do, right? Educate your children and have a safe home, have a safe place to live, and a chance to relax and enjoy life when you can get through the work day. So I want to make sure I'm not missing. Oh, here all this time I've had the wrong thing turned on here to see comments. But So let's see. So I'm going to look at some of these comments. It's interesting that you mentioned this alleged division between science fiction and real art. What do you think Vonnegut's writing can tell us about the contemporary world, especially in terms of current backlashes all over the world? Yeah, as the Supreme Court decision in the U.S. today, the war in the Ukraine, or even Brazil's current government. I hate to make it all sound like it's not unique, because we all have our unique struggles. But, you know, these are recurring themes in the history of man, right? These things. And sometimes it feels like the foxtrot, the, you know, one step forward, two steps back when it comes to human rights. I think that we think that we are the most modern people, and then we learn about something in the past where there were rights that were then later taken away, and we realize, like, well, we might not be as far along as we think we are when, you know, in advancements. I think he would be heartbroken to see what's going on these days. But I also think he would be inspired by, well, I'll tell you, in Indianapolis, our very museum is in the heart of the historic African-American cultural district that was alive and well in Indianapolis for dozens of years before the local government made that all go away through gentrification, running an interstate road system through the heart of the African-American cultural district. What we know from the Black Lives Movement of 2020, and what I feel, I can see it every day where we're located in our gorgeous building. I hope you can come visit us. And follow us on VonnegutLibrary.org and sign up for our newsletter on there, because we have people all over the world engaged with what we're doing, and especially when it comes to censorship. We send free books to people. You know, we have copies of Vonnegut's books in Portuguese and Spanish and, you know, other languages, but we're dealing with this stuff right now. As far as the Supreme Court decision today to take away those rights provided by Roe versus Wade for the ability for a woman to choose whether or not she needs to have an abortion or wants to, it's one thing when you don't have the right and, you know, you're working to try to get it. It's another thing when you have a right, or other people have, you know, others will benefit from certain rights, and then that right is taken away. I know he would have been one of those folks out protesting. I'm, you know, when on my way to Washington, D.C. now, and I anticipate that, you know, I believe it's tomorrow, that there will be lots of protests around Roe versus Wade. As far as the war in the Ukraine, the scariest thing, and that makes the book Mother Night so relevant too, is there are so many people who actually think there is not even a war in Ukraine, and do not think that Russian aggression has you know, done this, has devastated this country. I have friends who went over there to help refugees just across the border in Poland, personally handing out food and hearing these stories from hundreds and hundreds of people who are coming for food. You know, people of all kinds, all sorts of people who, you know, college professors whose husbands are still in Ukraine fighting, because that is the expectation, is that if you are, you know, if you are a male, a healthy male and a resident, you're going to be fighting for your homeland. It's a really challenging thing. People ask me a lot about, well, Vonnegut didn't like war. What do we think about this? Vonnegut of course he didn't like war. Who would like war? You know, none of the Marines that I ever served with thought that was a good thing, especially the ones who were in Vietnam, who actually experienced war. A lot of times I think people who haven't experienced war, they don't quite get it. But also he thought his war was really important to fight. There were so many issues, and he wasn't doing it just because Pearl Harbor was attacked, although that was really important to him. He wanted to do his part. He thought that, you know, Hitler was trying to take over the world, and also, of course, the atrocities being committed against Jews and intellectuals and you know, gay people and all kinds of people. So we are seeing all of these things happening right now in the world, plus a global pandemic. It's a scary time, but I think people turn to Vonnegut. We see that over these past couple of years and through the pandemic, that more and more people tune into us. So I hope you do go to VonnegutLibrary.org. We don't have all of our events up on the calendar as far as the, you know, some of the more the dialogues, the panel discussions, and all of that stuff. But please log on and sign in to get our newsletter, because we have people tuning in from everywhere. A really good thing that we do every year is Banned Books Week, and that is that last week of September under the umbrella of the American Library Association, where we celebrate the freedom to read. And, you know, he absolutely was an advocate for the ability to read whatever we want. And that's the approach we take, is, you know, we don't want to censor anything. Parents certainly have a right to choose for their, you know, their children, but we encourage that school teachers be trusted to pick what gets read in the classroom and discussed in the classroom. So our mission, it's not just to have a museum for Vonnegut. We are a community center, and we celebrate Vonnegut by advocating for free speech and common decency. So when Slaughterhouse-5 was threatened to be banned in Florida just over these past, you know, several weeks, we wrote a letter to, they call themselves Moms for Liberty, which is quite a misnomer, because they want to take rights away from people, not they're not trying to provide liberty for anybody. So anyway, I guess I'm just saying, like, we do, you know, we do a lot of different kinds of things to support people all over the world. But let me look at more of these questions. Let's see. Oh my gosh, the Vonnegut's use of humor. Well, actually, let me jump up to the one right before that I see is, I worked in biographies and archival collections. Was it that interest that led me to want to memorialize Vonnegut? Oh gosh, I love biography. I think people are so fascinating, right? And so even when I worked for Eli Lilly, I wanted to learn about who was Colonel Lilly. It turns out he was a Civil War colonel. Had a fascinating story. He was taken as a prisoner of war, and he helped negotiate a situation at a prisoner of war camp in the South where he was being held. And that's a whole other thing. I won't get into all that. But the first biography I ever read was about Eleanor Roosevelt, and I was like 7 years old. And that was it. When I learned about, you know, real people who had done some amazing things, I was hooked on biography. And I continue in my private time, my home time and weekends, to work on biography. I just love telling stories, especially stories of people who don't necessarily have somebody telling their story. So that's, you know, something I do. But thank you for that question. Okay. Yeah, and taking, you know, serving as witness, right? Because that's, if we don't do that for each other, those stories are gone. You know, those stories are lost. So we have to do that for each other. And even if you are not the person who wants to write a story, if you know someone has a great story, there are so many ways of capturing those through oral histories. or more. Should I keep going, Sandra?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, but I mean, maybe you have skipped a few questions that are really that appear beforehand. So maybe I should just read them to you. One of them is, what's the relationship between the museum and the academy? Do people and any Vonnegut scholar exchange a lot, and how?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. So just a couple of weeks ago, we worked with Indiana University, where Vonnegut's papers are held in their library. And they created a big Vonnegut festival called Grand Falloon, which was a word Vonnegut came up with. You can look that up. But so we created an exhibition because this is Vonnegut's 100th birthday year. So this is an exhibition that has a write-up for every one of those 100 years, something that was happening in Vonnegut's life. And then when we became a thing, there's, that introduction of us as part of this. But if you, and we travel to universities, we work with scholars on their books when they're trying to do research. I'm so happy for that question. Because, we will Zoom in with students. We, like I said, we will come and speak to audiences. We send books, we send free books. We do all kinds of things, but that scholarly piece is important. Many of the scholars that you'll be hearing about, if you're not familiar with Christina Jarvis, she has a wonderful book coming out about Vonnegut and science, and that will be later this year, published by Seven Stories Press, Vonnegut's very last publisher. But she came and she did research in our facility. She went down to Indiana University. Indiana University is just one of many universities that we partner with, whether it is for the analytical type of research, or maybe we have historians coming to us, or history teachers. We do a teacher workshop every summer. Again, that's on VonnegutLibrary.org. Anybody can join in on that. And also, if cost is an issue for anybody, we just ask them to reach out to us, because we never let cost be a barrier to our ability to share knowledge. So that's another thing that makes us, I think, a little different from some places. But it's a wonderful, healthy relationship. We received a little bit of funding this year to go to 5 different states in the United States. So we're going to California. I'm on my way to DC, as I mentioned, New York, Florida. We're going into Chicago, and we'd love to spread it worldwide. And it is not that we are spreading Vonnegut like a religion, right? Because he would hate to be a religion. He wasn't, he wanted us to be free thinkers, even if we did enjoy, the very good things that can sometimes be provided by an organized religion, right? But he did, it's not that we're spreading a religion, it's that we're spreading the discussion, the dialogue, his ideas that all relate to how to be better to each other and better to the planet.
Yeah, that's the let's say one of the aims, right, of keeping a library and keeping a center, isn't it?
Yes, and I have to say, when people encounter us, they feel like they want to stay involved with us, because it is not like going to some museum where, oh, don't touch that, or don't take pictures, or don't do this. When you get engaged with the Vonnegut Library, it's like a family, and people come back year after year to our teacher workshops, whether they're virtual or in person, or because whether they're famous comedians or authors or actors, there's so many famous people, but then also just regular people like me who just gravitated to Vonnegut, and we all blend together, all ages, all races, and it's it is a wonderful thing. The best people I've ever met are the people who are interested in studying Vonnegut.
We have another question here, and this question comes from a person who should actually visit you, right? Because Samuel is doing her MA in on his work. So the question is, you worked with the biographies and archival collections of Marines. It was your interest in preserving the memory of those who served that led you to Vonnegut. That's the first part of the question, I think. So the second part comes later. Can you tell us about the importance of preserving such testimonies and of taking responsibility for the role of witness to such experiences and teachings that are passed down to us?
Yeah, and so, I did not really hone in on that that bit about the service member, the soldier, and Vonnegut doing that. What it meant to the world when he told his story of Slaughterhouse 5. And that was just, that was, of course, his most famous novel, but there are a number of short stories that he wrote that are excellent. If you haven't read Welcome to the Monkey House, I also want to mention something about Welcome to the Monkey House, because people say, oh, well, he says this and he says that. Sometimes people read Vonnegut and they don't understand that that some of it is satire, and they get caught up in this idea. Oh, well, Vonnegut said this. Yeah, but it's satire. Like, then you don't get it, what he's trying to say. But anyway, back to this. I do think those soldier stories are important, but also Vonnegut specifically following the war, when so many people were saying what a wonderful, the United States role in ending the war and all of that. And Vonnegut was there to say, okay, hold on, wait a minute. Atrocities happen, and we have to talk about those, because that is what is certainly affected his mental health for the rest of his life. But then what does it do, for others? We're very close with the author Tim O'Brien, who wrote The Things They Carried about the Vietnam War. That's just an outstanding book about his war experience. And there are other authors too who were service members, military officers, or enlisted personnel who follow us, want to be involved, want to take part in our creative writing workshops, and we share those stories. We create a literary journal that we put out every year. When you go to VonnegutLibrary.org, you'll be able to to see those things if you're interested. It's not just military writing, it's all kinds of writing. I also want to mention that I don't think I gave my email address, but it is julia@VonnegutLibrary.org. If anybody, I should try to figure out how to put that. Maybe I can put that in.
Don't worry. I think Julia, or your namesake, Julia, or Samuel will do that. So don't worry about that.
Okay, great. Yeah, please do write to us. We'd love to stay in touch. And then, I'm sorry, was there a question that you said that I haven't shared?
No, I hope so. I hope you have. Sorry, I think you have actually answered that. There are two more here. One by George and the other by George. Namesakes again. I would like to George, that's also one of our MA students. I would like you to comment more on Vonnegut's use of humor as a critical tool to address complicated topics. How did he end up with this style of writing?
Oh, that's a really neat question. It starts with his family. They were funny people. They, despite the fact that they had mental health challenges, Vonnegut's mother, suffered from a number of mental health challenges, but they enjoyed humor. And they, like I said, they had a lot of cultural capital. So they were exposed to the brightest luminaries of the time. And it was important, it was really important to their family. And then Kurt, being the youngest, he wanted to get attention. So he was funny at the dinner table. He felt like he needed to be so that he could, be in the conversation with his older brother, who was so much more serious and interesting for different reasons. And then, of course, his sister Alice. He wanted her attention most, and he said that. But I think he also learned when he was a prisoner in Germany. I think he learned a lot from the British, the British soldiers who were also captured, because they, the British had at least as he describes it, they were not going to stay down for the esprit de corps and all of these things, and coming up with fun and interesting ways to occupy time, to keep spirits up. So I think he learned something there from the British soldiers. I think we see that in Slaughterhouse 5, some of the things he writes about there. So I think it's a combination of things that made him that way. But boy, being in that situation that during the same year when his mother died, right? And his mother died from suicide, we think. I mean, his children ask us, please don't say that, because she died from an overdose. We don't know for sure that she was intentionally trying to die. Vonnegut thought she was, based on things she had said about, difficulties in life prior to that. But that's another thing. Here you're dealing with, all of these horrible challenges. How do you, well, it's like I said in the beginning, right? It's laughter is better than tears, because it's just too hard. And it's just, it would be too hard to look at his life and not just fall apart if you didn't incorporate humor and love.
Thank you. I think there's another question by our colleague George. He says, thanks. Do you think that the idea of American exceptionalism is relevant to understand Vonnegut's views on politics and society?
Yes, and I love this question too, because I think it shows that Vonnegut struggling with himself, because he learned from his study of anthropology that we're all the same, right? We don't want to think of ourselves as the same when we think of when people say, I don't see color, and no, we see color, and that is part of what makes us all special, unique, and sharing interesting information and all of that. But interesting thing, when I was writing my book, I didn't know just how hard Vonnegut's parents were on him to be an exceptional student, exceptional in the things that he needed to do, as a young man. He had some struggles, even with deciding where he wanted to go to college and all of this sort of thing. We know that as a parent, he would tell his own children, like, really emphasize that you can do better than this. Like, don't settle for less. I expect you to do better. He wasn't, I don't believe he was quite as pushy as his own parents were about that kind of thing. But I think he loved other cultures. The more he traveled, I think he respected how different cultures approach things, like their elderly people and the knowledge that we can glean from our elders. But I think he was, kind of challenged himself about the balance of those things. I think he was very proud of things like Indiana jazz, in where we are on Indiana Avenue. That was a thriving jazz hub in the 1900s, and he would go there to listen to jazz music. It's often not mentioned along with New Orleans and St. Louis and Chicago and places, but it needs to be. So anyway, I could go on, but I hope I've answered your question.
Julia,
Yes.
I have to butt in and make a question about the future of the narratives of Vonnegut, because not only war is portrayed as an isolating experience in Vonnegut's fiction, he was also very critical of the new ways of engaging with narratives such as television. So in Timequake, he goes over theater plays that became ethical landmarks for him precisely because he experienced them among a congregation of rapt fellow human beings. And such stories would not have had such impact, he said, had he been alone eating nachos and gazing into the face of a cathode ray tube. So how can we now, as apart as we've ever been and as technological as we've ever been, work with all the new tools we have at our disposal to engage with fiction together? Thank you very much.
Oh, I love this question too. And, we kind of deal with that question a lot. It's, how do I want to go about this? I think that when we look at things like the fact that Vonnegut wrote letters by hand, and now our schools don't teach that kind of, script, that cursive writing, and what is lost by not doing that, not having that in our brains, that, that what that does positively for our brains. But also, he did not, right? He was a bit of a Luddite, right? But he still found ways, even when he was writing for the publication called In These Times. No, he wasn't using a computer and that kind of thing, but he was using a fax machine to get the information to. So, I mean, in his way, he was still using some technology to, to try to get the messages across. We do love that he said that he would still go to the post office to get a stamp for the envelope so that he could have that human interaction. We talk about this issue all the time, about even when we decide, are we going to do a program virtually, or are we going to have an in-person component? Will it be hybrid that way? Or, what? And more we talk about doing things hybrid because we saw during the pandemic that people need Vonnegut. They reached out. They said, I need to read more. I need to have a conversation with you. There is so much wisdom with him. And I think it is striking the right balance, because it wasn't like he was so against technology that he didn't use it himself, right? He did use some technology. But he knew from having been raised the way he was, with extended family, and everybody would go to the lake together and go swimming and do all of these things. He knew that there was so much mental health support within your own family. And then we see in his books where he talks about, lonesome no more, and these things, that loneliness that he experienced, when he was in New York. Even though he had great friends and lots of people, that finding that right balance between being too lonely, being too technology based, and then giving yourself that pleasure of being with people. So I don't know, but that's I do appreciate that you shared that. That's a good quote.
Any more questions? Alguém tem mais alguma pergunta? Por favor, ponham no chat. Samuel, you are the Vonnegut specialist.
Well,
so do you have any other questions?
I have more questions, but I don't want to take over.
No, but I mean, there are no other questions here on the chat. So just take your time and take advantage of Julia's being here with us.
Oh, I will. Thank you. So I have one question regarding science fiction and the way that he wrote it, because he said that you put it on your book, that he was glad to have dabbed in the sciences, for he could understand and interpret a great and interesting number of things which would otherwise be mysterious. But despite his technical knowledge, he always made a point to be very didactical in his writing instead of stranging the reader. Now, like, cognitive estrangement is one of the most important tools in science fiction as a narrative. It's what makes us face the other, the different, the alternative world. But Vonnegut was able to work with estrangement in a way that pulls the reader closer to the narrative, because he always writes everything so earnestly, so very clearly, actually.
Yes.
So how do you see this particular style of his pulling the reader into science fiction, and how does this line up with his beliefs on the duty of the writer towards his readers?
Yeah, and so I think part of that is like I said, about his ability to, be a journalist and write for all audiences. But also, I think he really enjoyed being the voice of all different kinds of people. When we think about how he was raised, so I mentioned about his mother, about the family being very wealthy. He said that when he came home from school every day, he would spend his time with the family housekeeper and cook. Her name was Ida Young, and she was African American, and she taught him Bible stories, and she was the one who asked him how his day was. And I think, and she was not educated beyond what she learned, in her from her church and from, her family and friends, and beyond regular grade school. And so, but he said she was closer to him than even his own mother, even though he had a great relationship with his mother and enjoyed many things about her. But I think all the different kinds of people he encountered, and in the military and, others, he wanted to be a voice for all kinds of people, and he knew he could do it. And he heard from Jane, his first wife, that he had it. He had that thing, whatever that thing is, where you can communicate with all kinds of people. The science part is so wonderful, because it made him different. Not it was at that time when, science fiction was becoming a big thing in short stories and magazines, but then also television. So part of it was being in the right place at the right time, but also some of it is just Vonnegut recognizing that, yes, he had his brother and his father who were pressuring him that's why he studied science at Cornell, because they were pressuring him to study science, and that he didn't really want to, and then in the military he was trained, he learned engineering and some other things, and so he liked knowing those things. Like as he said, he felt like that was a good thing for his writing life. He says that in that book of letters that he wrote to Jane. He said the science will make a big difference, but he always wanted to be a writer. In part, I think, and I think he says this somewhere too, that his mother had tried to be a writer, and she was writing jingles, and she was sending off things to women's magazines, but she was unsuccessful. And so when he started being published, somewhere he wrote that he felt like he was fulfilling his mother's dream of being a writer, but also he enjoyed writing and had been writing, his whole life in school. So interesting guy, right? And that science part is something that absolutely makes him fascinating.
Yeah, because he lots of people point that in Slaughterhouse 5, he used science fiction as kind of a means to an end, because it solved a problem, the problem of how to formalize the disruption of time and space because of the protagonist's PTSD. But Vonnegut kind of actually ended up being molded by science fiction way more than he expected it, you know? It's so interesting how this process worked.
Yes, and he did. He absolutely loved it. He was so interested, even though he didn't always do well in his, science classes. But part of that, he said, was from being in a fraternity and, that sort of thing. But, I just lost what I was going to say, but, I'm so sorry. Can you just repeat the last sentence that you said? Because it was something about
that science fiction actually molded him in return. So he changed. He grew a lot into science fiction. It's not just a problem solver. It's not just because it has time travel and all those formal ways of portraying PTSD or something like that.
Okay, thank you for doing that, because that really helped me. So have you seen the film about Vonnegut, made by Robert Whitey?
Yeah.
Okay, so that you might remember in the beginning of the film, his publisher, Dan Simon, said that part about Kurt said that before the war and all of that, he was in the forest and he leaned against a tree and he saw what happened in Dresden. I don't know if you remember that part. And Dan Simon says he wasn't joking and he wasn't just being dramatic. And Dan Simon believed that he had this vision of this happening. I'm not saying that's true, but I am saying that time and time travel, something was going on there. And we do know from Mark Vonnegut's mental health challenges and the books that his son Mark has written that there was, we know from the whole family and Vonnegut's mother and others that in the ancestors that there were mental health challenges. But even Mark Vonnegut talked about when he was a child, he would hear voices. He thought they were voices from God or from angels, and that was very real for him. And so I do wonder, and also with this mother's death and what, because no one really talked too much about that in depth. There have been a few interviews where it came up, but I do wonder what did that do to him as far as thinking about what time meant. Because Slaughterhouse 5 is so great that way. And now we know from science that time is so much more complicated than we knew, and we look at all they're learning about black holes and all of this. It's like, wow, we really don't know all that much, even though we know more than we did when Vonnegut wrote Slaughterhouse. But I think he did love that. I think he loved that.
Just like when he pointed at the sky and said, "There's Trofamador," as a kid. It's very interesting how he came up with it so early.
Something so special was going on with him. When I said the part about being raised in Indianapolis, and I think being raised in that environment where he didn't want for anything, even though the parents had struggled more than they had to in the past. He had that time and extended family love, safety, a good school. He had that ability to just think. He didn't have to just survive like a lot of folks in Indianapolis have to do now, living downtown, high crime in certain areas. Other areas are completely safe and wonderful and all of that. But, we struggle, our public schools struggle, our schools are very different from when he was going to public school in Indianapolis. So I wondered too about that. But then to have all of those things happen to him, and what did post-traumatic stress disorder, what did that do to him? What kind of brain injuries did he have when he was tortured by the Nazis? I mean, we know he was tortured. We know he was hit in the head with the butt of a rifle, what does that do to that portion of the brain that we don't use necessarily?
Yeah, if I may make just
So
a comment.
Can I? You have a comment, because we have another question here. So make a comment.
No. Go for the question.
No. But I mean, if it's related, I think you better make it now before I move on to something else.
Just a quote that he said. You have that quote in your book as well. That some people accuse science fiction of being extremely escapist, but you were talking about home and community and how important those things were for Vonnegut, and he said that home is not Mars. Home is here. So through the writing of science fiction, he's not trying to get somewhere else. He's trying to build community and human relationships here. So I think that's very interesting to note in his writings, and not just say that he was trying to get somewhere else because here is horrible and there are wars and etc. He was trying to fix things.
Yes, and that's so important. That is really the essence of Kurt Vonnegut, what you just captured. I mean, because he says that the very most important, I can't get the quote quite right, but it's our community. That is the single most important thing, and his interest in studying religions, but then also at times claiming atheism, certainly always claiming humanism. It all comes back to community. He knew that, I mean, for him, that was the only real thing that we have. And we see in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, which was the book I read right before I started the Vonnegut Library. And by the way, I was not I wasn't somebody who had wealth. I didn't have prominence in the community. I was this worker bee at this big corporation. And I just had the idea for the Vonnegut Library and just started asking people. And then it took the whole country, the whole city, the whole country, the whole world to help put this thing together. But that, I love that idea that, really in the end, we have love, we have education, and we have community. And those are kind of the things that we see that really matter.
So much in need, right?
Yes.
So much in need. Now, there's a question of Anna Ruth, who's also in our group. So I wanted to know a little more about Julia's perspective as a writer. How does Vonnegut influence your way of writing?
Well, and so his experiences were so different from mine, but there were some overlapping. Like I worked for my town newspaper when I was 16. I had been working this fast food job, and then I couldn't keep up. I wasn't good at it, and so I went to the town newspaper. And so I think and hope that I also write clear sentences, the way, like he did. I have a different writing style from his. I think he's certainly edited far more than I do, and that is to his credit. Maybe if I'd had more than 3 months, I would have edited mine more, but maybe not, because we know that he, from going to looking at his papers at Indiana University Library, we see that he has draft after draft after draft. I love that. He had 9 different endings for Slaughterhouse 5. Isn't that fascinating? Completely different endings for that novel. And that's not me. I'm gonna, even if I have more than 3 months, I'm not writing 9 different endings to something. I'm getting it done and moving on. But I did learn in the process of writing this book that I love writing. I'd been writing for my job, throughout my life. But the thing that I did not expect when I wrote this, I didn't expect to want to share myself in my book. When you write a book, you decide what is important. You know, I talk about his quest for unconditional love in this book and how important that was to him. And you know, I guess I thought that I would be more interested in the specific facts that I put out there. But then after I published the book, I realized I wanted people to read it because it shares me too, the things that matter to me. And anybody who writes a book, it is, you know, it's what they choose to focus on, or, you know, the angle they take. So that was a fun surprise for me to understand other writers like, oh, now I get why you're so excited about your book coming out. It's not like you're trying to make money, because you don't make any money when you're writing a book. It's so funny. It's great though. The Vonnegut Library makes 10 times more from selling this book than I do. Isn't that funny? But I think maybe I didn't get the best deal. I don't know.
You have just sort of aroused somebody's curiosity here. Your namesake, Julia, wants to know if you can tell us the alternative endings to Slaughterhouse 5, because she didn't know about that. So I don't know if Samuel did, but anyway.
I can, I'm forgetting some of how all of that goes, but you know, Billy Pilgrim not dying, and you know, I can't really speak to much more. I'm kind of just forgetting what those are. Our colleague, our curator, Crystal Fave, might be a better source for that. I can provide that. And I, you know, or having him die differently. But one thing I started to share that I didn't really get out was when I talked about Billy Pilgrim not specifically being Vonnegut. I did share in the book that Billy Pilgrim was based on a character, a real person who simply died in the war because he lost the will to live. He was a prisoner of war with Vonnegut, and the way he was mistreated, that character in the book, this person, Ed Crone, was mistreated by fellow soldiers, and I just think that's a really important thing, because, you know, people always assume that the main character is the writer, or at least I've heard that. It's like, no, that's not what was going on here. But anyway, I'm so sorry, Julia, I can't give you more details about all the different endings.
You have suggested, you know, that it's a good idea to visit the library and look into the archives, and there's Julia's suggestion, let's say, has been welcomed by by George. So we should all go and visit the library.
We would love to. And like I said, we're not like any other group you would ever encounter, because if you contact us and tell us you're coming to visit, and, you know, let us know how that we, you know, met each other through this, we show people the city. We introduce them to all the Vonnegut places and roll out the red carpet. And that's what Vonnegut was talking about when he talked about Indianapolis. And, you know, that's why sometimes he picked on Indianapolis, because it can be behind the times on things. But that whole Hoosier hospitality thing, that is a real thing. It is different there. You know, if somebody's having trouble, you're never alone. If you're in Indianapolis, people want to open up their homes to you and I see that. I've lived all over the world. You know, I lived in Bangladesh and Thailand. I've traveled all through Europe and parts of Asia. And we see that, I mean, people open up their homes to total strangers, right? And that's something Vonnegut loved and also was very familiar with as well. But yes, we would love to have you visit. We would love to do Zoom meetings with students and have you join our teacher workshops and, you know, all of that kind of stuff.
That's very good news. So Samuel should take the advantage, you know. Take it.
Yes,
absolutely. Thank you so much.
We don't have any more questions here on the chat, and I suppose you must be tired. You still have 8 hours driving?
Yes.
So perhaps we should just let you go. No, we don't want to make you too tired, because, I mean, you have to be very focused in order to do your 8 hours in your car. So,
well, thank you. And, like I said, I'd love for you to stay in touch, and maybe we can send our traveling exhibit about Vonnegut. Even if we're not coming, there are all kinds of ways that we can share knowledge, and I want to make that a two-way street as well, because Vonnegut, I said he wouldn't have wanted a museum just to himself and his artifacts. We're a community engagement center, and our community is global. So, telling the stories of the human condition, that's what matters to us. A lot of our programs don't necessarily relate to Vonnegut, but they do relate in that he would want stories to be told. And, this year we're saying a century of stories. And so we're telling all kinds of unknown stories about, all different kinds of people around the country and around the world.
Well, we would like to thank you very much for your talk, for the offer to go on talking about Vonnegut and other topics related to him. And perhaps Samuel would like to also say a few last words.
I would just like to say that it was a wonderful ending to our conference. It was just so great, so uplifting. You told me that your talk would be uplifting, and you would send everyone off in a high note, and you absolutely did it. So thank you so much, because it really, gets us interested in, like, those of us who haven't read Vonnegut yet, to read him. It was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I was hard on my publisher, but I was so grateful to have been published. But without Vonnegut, my life would have been a lot more challenging if I wouldn't have had his work. I never met him, but we turned to Vonnegut for the humor that we talked about, and those beautiful descriptions of the human condition.
There's also a comment by Julia. She says it was a lovely conversation. It was great. It's great to hear how committed you and the library are with his work and memory. Also, a thank you from Anna. Thank you so much, Julia. Such inspiring words. And also a thank you from other people who are sharing their thanks in the chat here.
Thank you so much. I hope we stay in touch.
Yes, we will. Thank you very much, and drive safely, please.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Pessoal, acho que a gente pode... A Júlia teve que sair agora rapidinho, mas acho que a gente pode também encerrar o evento, né? Ela estava muito gentilmente, parou na viagem dela para falar com a gente.
Uhum.
Antes da gente encerrar, eu queria agradecer a todos que nos acompanharam nesses 3 dias. Acho que foi um evento muito, muito interessante, com discussões excelentes. A gente sempre sai desses eventos com uma lista enorme para ler, né? A gente estava falando disso, como o nosso grupo agora tem 1000 coisas novas para ler, e é sempre um prazer poder compartilhar o que a gente faz e o que os colegas estão fazendo. Então, queria agradecer a todo mundo que acompanhou o evento, e mais ainda gostaria de agradecer ao Samuel, a Ana, o Jorge e o Pedro, que, assim, esse grupo foi maravilhoso de organização. Acho que a gente trabalhou muito bem junto, a gente fez um grande evento. A Ana e o Jorge não estão aqui, mas também estavam com a gente ao longo do evento e acompanhando tudo, e também apareceram também aqui nas telinhas. E também um grande obrigada à Sandra e ao Jorge pela oportunidade de deixar a gente, né, sediar esse evento no LERo, que é sempre um prazer enorme, assim, trabalhar no LERo e compartilhar. Acho que, como a gente já falou várias vezes, eu acho que a pandemia também possibilitou isso, né? Essa questão online dá para a gente compartilhar as nossas discussões, as nossas pesquisas e o que a gente tem feito, não só no laboratório, mas nas outras universidades, com pessoas do país inteiro e do mundo inteiro também. Então é isso, obrigada, gente.
Júlia, eu só queria dizer que não se trata de deixar, né? Que acho que falo também em nome do Jorge, que não se trata de deixar ou dar permissão, etc., mas se trata, de fato, de compartilhar um espaço que foi criado também coletivamente. Porque, assim como disse a Júlia, a sua xará, na fala dela várias vezes, né, nós também acreditamos nessa ideia de comunidade, de coletividade, que isso é mais do que nunca necessário. Então, não se trata mesmo, né, de uma permissão, mas sim de um trabalho conjunto no qual vocês têm colaborado e contribuído muitíssimo. Eu acho que agradeço também em nome do Jorge todo o trabalho de vocês, que pegaram esse evento já desde o ano passado. Esse ano vocês fizeram uma nova edição do evento. Já estou vendo aqui no chat que já estão pedindo o terceiro, né? Então, vocês já têm esse compromisso aí, né, de organizar o próximo no próximo ano. E é um assunto que, de fato, desperta um enorme interesse e nada como a gente ter essa possibilidade agora dessas plataformas, para compartilhar isso com o maior número de pessoas possível, o maior número de interessados. Muito obrigada, eu digo a vocês. E nós, né? Acho que digo em nome do Jorge também.
Obrigada, Sandra, pelas kind words. É muito bom. Não, obrigada. E é isso, gente. Muito obrigada a todos que estiveram aqui conosco. É isso. Quem sabe ano que vem tem mais. Acho que o que não falta é vontade. A gente adora organizar esse evento.
Olha, só lembrando aqui, o Jorge está lembrando no chat que estão todos convidados para o evento do LERo, Romances do Extremo Oriente, que vai se realizar em setembro. E nós vamos, evidentemente, divulgar todas as informações na nossa página, né? Nós temos uma página no Facebook, nas redes, enfim, na própria página da Faculdade de Filosofia, né? Então, aguardem e esperamos todos vocês de volta aqui no próximo evento. Obrigada a todos.
Obrigada, gente. Tchau, tchau.